Hey friends, welcome back. Tonight, we're stepping into a world where winter wasn't just cold, it was a predator. You're about to walk the frozen streets of Victorian London, where the fog tasted like metal, where ice formed on the inside of walls, and where simply breathing could kill you. This isn't some romantic Dickensian Christmas card. This is the reality of a city choking on its own success, where coal smoke turned the sky yellow, where children worked barefoot in the Thames, and where the mathematics of survival came down to, can you afford fire, food, and 4 walls before February takes you? Good thing this isn't your life, but for millions of Londoners, from the 1830s through the 1890s, winter was the season that separated the living from the dead. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from tonight and whether it's snowing where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step off the train at Paddington Station on a January morning in 1858. And the first thing that hits you isn't the cold, it's the taste. The air has texture here, thick as fabric, and it coats your tongue with the flavour of burning coal, sulphur, and something metallic that makes your teeth ache. You can barely see 10 feet ahead. The fog, though Londoners don't call it fog anymore, they call it pea soup because of its yellow-brown colour, presses against your face like a damp cloth. This isn't weather. This is something London creates for itself, breath by breath, chimney by chimney. Welcome to the Great Smoke, though that cheerful name doesn't capture what's actually happening to your lungs right now. You're inhaling the exhaust of 1 million coal fires, mixed with industrial emissions from factories, mixed with the natural Thames Valley fog, all trapped by temperature inversions that turn the city into a gas chamber. Scientists will eventually identify sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, and particulate matter in concentrations that would trigger modern evacuation orders. But right now, in the middle of the 19th century, this is just Tuesday. You pull your coat tighter, assuming you have a coat, which roughly 40% of London's population doesn't, and start walking. The cold here operates differently than cold in the countryside. It's wetter, heavier, aggressive. The Thames makes everything damp, and the damp makes everything colder. Thermometers might read 38 degrees Fahrenheit, but the chill factor, what the wind and moisture do to exposed skin, makes it feel closer to 20. Your fingers start going numb within minutes. The fog plays tricks with sound. You hear footsteps that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere. A horse-drawn omnibus materializes like a ghost ship, its driver shouting warnings you can barely interpret. During the worst fogs, and historians still debate whether the Great Smoke of December 1873 or the one in 1880 killed more people, pedestrians literally walked into the Thames because they couldn't see the embankment. Link boys, children hired to carry torches and guide people through the darkness, could charge a week's wages for a single night's work. Though some of them, entrepreneurs at age 9, would deliberately lead customers in circles to extend the job. You pass a street vendor selling hot chestnuts from a brazier, and the warm glow is the only light source you've seen in minutes. The chestnuts are probably half rotten. Food standards won't exist for another 40 years. But the heat radiating from that little fire makes people cluster around it like pilgrims at a shrine. This is the fundamental equation of Victorian winter. Heat equals life, and heat costs money most people don't have. A woman brushes past you, coughing. It's a wet, rattling sound that ends in a wheeze. You'll hear that cough everywhere in winter London, because roughly 70% of the population carries tuberculosis in various stages. The disease they call consumption thrives in cold, damp, crowded conditions. It's the #1 killer in Victorian Britain, claiming 1 in 4 deaths. The fog you're breathing right now, thick with coal smoke and fecal particles from the street, is an express train to respiratory infection. Bronchitis, pneumonia, tuberculosis. Winter delivers them all with ruthless efficiency. But what makes this fog truly lethal isn't just what's in it, it's what it does to the city's infrastructure. You'll discover this shortly. Gas lamps can't penetrate the murk, so streets go dark even at noon. Trains stop running because engineers can't see signals. Theatres cancel performances because audiences can't find the entrance. Commerce grinds to a halt. And in a city where missing a day's work means missing a day's food, that paralysis translates directly to suffering. You finally reach your destination, a boarding house in Clerkenwell, and climb the narrow stairs. Your landlady nods as you pass. She's wrapped in 3 shawls despite being indoors, and her breath makes clouds in the hallway. You're about to learn that in Victorian London, indoors is a relative concept. The walls here are barely thicker than your hand, single brick construction with no insulation, no vapor barrier, nothing between you and the weather except one layer of clay and mortar. And right now, that's not nearly enough. Your room is waiting for you on the 3rd floor, and the first thing you notice when you open the door is that the temperature inside is maybe 5 degrees warmer than outside. Maybe. You press your palm against the interior wall and feel ice crystals forming on the plaster. Not frost on the window, frost on the inside wall. The dampness that defines London winters has seeped through the porous brick, and now it's freezing in place, creating delicate fern patterns that would be beautiful if they weren't evidence of structural failure. This is how most Londoners live. The Victorian building boom that turned London from a city of 900,000 in 1801 to over 6 million by 1900 prioritised speed and profit over quality. Developers threw up terrace houses and tenement blocks using the absolute minimum materials, often on poorly drained land, with roofs that leaked and foundations that wicked moisture like sponges. The result is housing stock that's barely habitable in summer and actively dangerous in winter. You light a candle, your only light source until you can afford lamp oil, which you can't, and survey your kingdom. One room, roughly 12 feet by 10 feet, an iron bedstead with a straw mattress, a rickety table, one chair, and a small fireplace that's the room's only heat source. The fireplace uses about 100 weight of coal per week to provide marginal warmth, and coal costs money. Right now, coal is running about 1 shilling per hundredweight. You earn, if you're lucky enough to have regular work, perhaps 15 shillings a week. That's assuming you're an adult man with a skilled trade. Women earn half that, children earn a quarter. So you do the math. Spend a shilling on coal or spend it on food. Historians estimate that working class families in London allocated roughly 60 to 70% of their income just to food. Rent took another 15 to 20%. That left almost nothing for fuel. So most families compromised. They burned enough coal to keep from literally freezing to death, but not enough to be comfortable. They huddled around tiny fires that barely heated a 3-foot radius. They went to bed wearing every piece of clothing they owned. You pile on 2 thin blankets. The wool ones cost more than a week's wages, so you've got cotton, which provides minimal insulation when damp, which it always is. And try to sleep. But the cold seeps in. It comes up through the floorboards, which have gaps you can see the room below through. It radiates from the walls. It presses down from the ceiling. Your toes go numb first, then your fingers, then your nose. You curl into a ball, tucking your hands into your armpits, breathing into the tiny warm space you're trying to create under the blankets. Around you, the house groans. Other tenants are trying to sleep too. 4 or 5 or 6 to a room the same size as yours. In the worst tenements, the rookeries of St Giles or Jacob's Island, entire families share spaces barely 8 feet square. They sleep in shifts because there's not enough floor space for everyone to lie down simultaneously. And some people don't have even this much. The penny hang was a real thing. A rope stretched across a room where people could lean on it to sleep standing up, charged a penny per night. Marginally better than the street, not better enough to matter. But here's what really makes Victorian winter housing brutal. Condensation. Your breath contains moisture. Every person sleeping in this house is exhaling warm, damp air. In a properly ventilated, properly heated modern home, that moisture dissipates. Here, it condenses on the coldest surface available, which is every surface. The windows drip constantly. The walls weep. Mold blooms in black patches across the ceiling. This isn't just uncomfortable, it's pathogenic. Those mold spores, combined with the dampness, create perfect conditions for respiratory disease. Some families tried creative solutions. Newspaper makes decent insulation when stuffed into wall cracks. Rags around window frames reduce drafts. Some people brought their work home and used the body heat from multiple people labouring in close quarters to warm the room. Historians still debate whether the tradition of Victorian families eating dinner together was about social cohesion or simply about everyone needing to be near the one fire. Probably both. You finally drift into uneasy sleep around midnight, and you dream of warmth. But even in sleep, you're shivering. Your body is burning calories trying to maintain core temperature. Calories you don't have to spare, because your dinner tonight was a halfpenny's worth of bread and a cup of weak tea. The slow mathematics of hypothermia are working on you, degree by degree. And outside, the fog presses against the window like something alive, patient, waiting. You wake to the sound of coughing. It's coming from the room next door, a wet, percussive bark that goes on until you hear retching. Then silence. Then the coughing starts again. This is the soundtrack of winter in Victorian London, the symphony of dying lungs. You'll hear it in every building, on every street corner, in every factory. The consumptive cough that signals tuberculosis, the white death. The disease that politely called going into decline because people wasted away so gradually. By the time you dress, which means putting on the same clothes you slept in, because you own exactly one set, and head out to find work, you've heard 17 different people coughing. Some are children, their small bodies racked with spasms that seem too violent for their frames. Some are elderly, their coughs dry and weak. But most are adults in their 20s and 30s, in what should be the prime of life, slowly drowning in fluid their own lungs produce. Here's what tuberculosis does. It's a bacterial infection that primarily attacks the lungs, creating cavities in the tissue and triggering massive inflammation. Your body tries to fight back by producing mucus and fluid. You cough, trying to clear your airways. But the bacteria keep multiplying and your lungs keep filling, and eventually you can't get enough oxygen. Death by suffocation, spread out over months or years. It's spectacular unpleasant. And in Victorian London, it's everywhere. The numbers tell the story. Tuberculosis mortality in London during the mid-1800s ran between 300 and 400 deaths per 100,000 people annually. That's roughly 1 in every 300 Londoners dying of consumption every single year. But mortality rates were much higher in winter. Cold, damp air irritates damaged lungs. Indoor crowding spreads the bacteria. Poor nutrition weakens immune systems. January and February saw death rates spike by 30 to 40% compared to summer months. You're walking through Bethnal Green now, one of London's poorest districts, and you pass a woman sitting on her front step despite the cold. She's maybe 30 years old, but she looks 50. Her face is pale, almost translucent, with hectic red spots on her cheeks, the consumptive flush caused by fever. She's coughing into a rag, and when she pulls it away, you see blood. Hemoptysis, the medical term for coughing up blood, is a signature symptom of advanced tuberculosis. It happens when the cavities in your lungs erode into blood vessels. She'll be dead by March. Probably. There's no cure, no treatment beyond rest and fresh air, which is impossible for someone who needs to work to eat. The sanatoriums that will become popular at the turn of the century don't exist yet in any meaningful number. So she'll keep coughing, keep working as long as she can stand, and eventually she'll stay in bed and not get up again. Her family will scrape together money for the cheapest possible funeral, and life will continue. But tuberculosis isn't the only respiratory killer stalking Victorian winters. You pass a doctor's surgery, you can tell by the brass plaque and the slightly less filthy street in front, and overhead, fragments of conversation. Acute bronchitis. No, try the mustard plaster. Pneumonia in both lungs. Winter is harvest season for pulmonary disease. Bronchitis, pneumonia, pleurisy, croup in children. They all spike when the temperature drops and the fog thickens. The fog itself is a disease vector. Modern analysis of Victorian-era fog would reveal it contains sulfuric acid formed when sulfur dioxide from coal smoke combines with water vapor. You're breathing dilute acid right now. It's why your throat feels raw, why your eyes sting, why that persistent cough never quite goes away. Historians still debate the total death toll from major fog events, but the Great Smoke of 1873 probably killed at least 700 people in a few days, most from respiratory failure. Children suffer worst of all. Their smaller airways are more easily blocked by mucus and inflammation. Their immune systems are still developing, and they're exposed to everything, working outdoors in all weather, sleeping in crowded, damp rooms, inadequately fed and clothed. Infant mortality in working-class London neighbourhoods hovers around 150 per 1,000 live births. That's 15%. 1 in 7 babies dies before their first birthday, most from respiratory or gastrointestinal infections, most in winter. You watch a small funeral procession pass, a tiny white coffin carried by a single man, followed by a woman in black who might be the mother. No one else. These minimal ceremonies are so common they barely register. White coffins for children, black for adults. That's how you tell from a distance. The death industry in Victorian London is booming, if you'll forgive the dark humour. Undertakers, coffin makers, mourning clothiers. They all do brisk business when winter arrives. But here's the thing that makes this truly brutal. People knew. Doctors understood that cold, damp conditions promoted disease. Reformers wrote extensively about the connection between housing quality and mortality. Charles Dickens, Henry Mayhew, Charles Booth, they all documented the slaughter in vivid detail. But change came slowly because change required money, and money required political will, and political will required that the people dying had enough power to demand it. They didn't. So winter kept killing, season after season, while the rest of the city went about its business. Dawn breaks, theoretically because the fog is too thick to see the sun, and you join the river of humanity flowing toward work. If you're lucky, you have indoor employment. If you're not, you're heading to the Thames. The river in winter is a brutal workplace, and today you're going to experience it firsthand. You've taken a job as a coal porter, unloading barges that bring fuel from the northern coalfields. It pays 4p an hour. For 16 hours of work, you'll earn 5 shillings and 4p, assuming you don't lose fingers to frostbite. The Thames stairs, stone steps leading down to the water, are slick with ice and algae. You descend carefully, watching other workers slip and catch themselves. Falling in isn't fatal if someone pulls you out quickly, but it's close. The water temperature in January hovers around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. You'd have maybe 15 minutes before hypothermia made swimming impossible. And these aren't waters anyone swims in anyway. The Thames is an open sewer, but we'll get to that later. Today you're relatively fortunate. You're working a barge. But look to your left and you'll see the mudlarks. Children, mostly, ranging from age 6 to 12, wading through the exposed mud at low tide, searching for anything valuable. Coal pieces dropped from barges, nails, rope fragments, copper fittings, anything that can be sold. They work barefoot because shoes cost money, and besides, shoes would just get sucked off in the mud anyway. Their feet are cracked and bleeding. Their hands are raw. The river mud contains human waste, industrial runoff, dead animals, and enough bacteria to give you a dozen diseases simultaneously. Historians estimate several thousand children worked the Thames as mudlarks, scavengers who made a precarious living from London's waste. They earned perhaps threepence on a good day. That threepence might mean the difference between their family eating or not. So they waded into freezing mud, bent double for hours, their small bodies turning blue from cold. Many developed chronic respiratory conditions. Some lost toes or fingers to frostbite. Some simply disappeared, pulled under by mud or tide or exhaustion, their absences noted by no one except their families. Your own work isn't much better. You're hauling 100-pound sacks of coal from barge to dock, up slippery planks for 16 straight hours. Your gloves, you manage to afford gloves, which immediately sets you above the truly desperate, are thin leather that's already soaked through. Wet leather provides no insulation. Your hands ache with cold, then go numb, then start to hurt again in ways that make you gasp. This is the beginning of what medical professionals call non-freezing cold injury. Damage that occurs at temperatures above freezing, but with prolonged exposure to wet cold. The men working beside you move like automatons, mechanical and silent. Everyone's conserving energy, breathing through scarves to warm the air slightly before it hits their lungs. The fog is so thick you can barely see the opposite bank of the Thames, though you're standing in the middle of the world's most powerful city, the heart of an empire that spans the globe. That contrast isn't lost on anyone. Britain controls India, Africa, Canada, Australia, but it can't keep its own citizens warm or dry. You work through what passes for noon, marked by church bells you can hear but not see. There's no break for lunch because taking a break means losing wages. You gnaw on a chunk of bread you brought, standing there in the cold, stamping your feet to keep blood flowing. Around you, the river teems with activity despite the weather. London's entire economy moves through this port. Coal and wool coming in, manufactured goods going out. The empire runs on Thames shipping, which means the empire runs on the backs of men and children freezing on these docks. By hour 12, you've stopped feeling your feet entirely. This should alarm you. It's a sign of progressing cold injury, but you can't afford to stop. By hour 14, you're moving on willpower alone, your body a collection of aches and numbness. The foreman, himself barely warmer in his slightly better coat, watches everyone with the calculation of a man who knows that workers who can't keep pace won't be hired tomorrow. Around you, other industries grind on. Match factories, where girls as young as 8 dip wooden sticks in white phosphorus, breathing fumes that rot their jawbones in a condition called phossy jaw. Tanneries, where workers stand in vats of chemical brine that burn their skin. Brick kilns that provide minimal warmth while filling your lungs with particulates. The Victorian economy runs on cheap labour, and winter just makes that labour cheaper because desperation rises with the cold. Some tried to organise. Early trade unions pushed for better conditions, shorter hours, winter breaks. But the labour surplus was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of people competed for every job. If you complained about working 16 hours in the freezing rain, 50 men would line up to take your place. Historians still debate whether industrialization improved or worsened conditions for working poor, but in winter, the question felt academic. When your choice was freeze while working or freeze while starving, you worked. Finally, 16 hours after you started, the foreman calls time. You've earned your 5 shillings and 4pence. Your hands are ruined, the skin cracked and bleeding, fingers swollen. Your feet squelch in your boots, soaked through despite the leather. Your lungs burn from inhaling cold, polluted air all day. You'll spend 2p on hot food from a street vendor because you need the calories and the warmth more than you need the money. And tomorrow, assuming your hands still work, you'll do it all again. Some wealthy Victorians noticed and cared. Philanthropic efforts increased during winter. Charity blankets, soup kitchens, coal distributions. Churches organised relief funds. Wealthy women ran district visiting programs, bringing food and fuel to the poor. But these efforts were drops in an ocean of need. To meaningfully improve conditions required structural change. Better housing, higher wages, public health infrastructure. That change was coming. The reform movements of the late Victorian era would eventually improve conditions. But it came slowly, too slowly for the people freezing right now. You pass a church holding a service. Through the open door, you hear hymns about comfort and mercy. The sanctuary is probably the warmest public space in the neighbourhood, heated for the congregation. Some people, you notice, are sleeping in the pews in back. Homeless people who snuck in for the warmth. The vicar knows, of course he knows, but he doesn't chase them out. Small mercies in a brutal season. By the time you reach your boarding house, full darkness has fallen, though fallen isn't quite right. The darkness just deepened because it's been dim all day. You climb the stairs, enter your room, and face the nightly calculation. How much coal can you afford to burn? You settle on enough for 2 hours of marginal warmth, enough to dry your clothes slightly. Then the fire will die and you'll sleep in the cold again. And tomorrow you'll do it all over. This is winter in Victorian London for most people. Not a season, but a siege. Something to be endured until spring's arrival. If spring arrives. If you survive that long. Historians estimate that a wealthy household in Victorian London might burn 3 to 5 tons of coal per winter season. That's 60 to 100 hundredweight. At a shilling per hundredweight, that's 3 to 5 pounds, more than a working class family earned in a month. And that was just for heating. Wealthy families also had better nutrition, warmer clothing, access to medical care. Winter for them was an inconvenience perhaps, a season requiring slightly heavier coats, not a threat to survival. You watch a servant, you can tell by her uniform and the purposeful way she moves, pull the curtains closed. The glimpse of warmth vanishes. You're back in the fog, in the cold, holding a now empty potato skin that provided maybe 5 minutes of hand warmth. The contrast would be crushing if you had time to dwell on it, but you don't. You need to get back to your room before the temperature drops further. But as you walk, you think about numbers. London in 1858 has about 2.8 million people. Perhaps 300,000 of them live in genuine comfort. Another 700,000 live in modest but adequate conditions. Enough heat, enough food, secure work. That leaves roughly 1.8 million people living in various degrees of poverty, from the working poor who barely scrape by to the absolutely destitute who sleep in doorways and eat from trash heaps. The winter death toll falls almost entirely on that bottom 65%. Charles Booth's famous poverty maps, created in the 1890s, used colour coding to show wealth distribution across London. Black for the lowest class, dark blue for very poor, light blue for poor, purple for mixed, pink for fairly comfortable, red for middle class, yellow for wealthy. When you overlay winter mortality data onto Booth's maps, the correlation is stark. The black and blue areas, places like Whitechapel, Bethnal Green, Southwark, show death rates 3 to 4 times higher than the red and yellow areas. Winter was a class-specific killer. You take your hot potato, literally just a baked potato sold from a cart, one of the few foods poor Londoners can afford, and eat it while walking west toward Mayfair. You're not going there to stay, obviously. You're going there to see. Because one of the most brutal things about Victorian London winters isn't just the cold or the work or the disease. It's the proximity. Wealth and poverty exist side by side, sometimes separated by a single street, and the contrast is sharp enough to cut. You cross an invisible boundary somewhere around Oxford Street, and the change is immediate. The fog here is the same. Coal smoke doesn't respect property lines, but everything else transforms. The streets are wider, cleaner, lit by more and better gas lamps. The buildings are substantial, 3 or 4 stories of solid stone with decorative facades. And through windows, large windows with heavy drapes and mullioned glass, you glimpse another world entirely. That's a drawing room. You can see it clearly because the family hasn't closed the curtains yet. There's a fire blazing in the hearth, and it's not a tiny, rationed fire. It's a proper, roaring fire, probably consuming in one evening what you'd normally burn in a week. The room glows with warmth. You can see a woman in an evening dress sitting near the fire, reading. She's not huddled in a shawl. She's not even wearing a wrap. She's comfortable enough to have bare shoulders. The Victorian wealthy didn't experience winter the way you did down at the Thames. They heated multiple rooms simultaneously. They had coal cellars that stored tons of fuel, enough to keep fires burning all day and night. They had thick walls, double-glazed windows, heavy curtains that created dead air spaces for insulation. They had carpets and rugs that kept floors warm. They had servants who got up before dawn to light fires, so the family woke to pre-warmed rooms. The technology existed to defeat winter. It just cost money most people didn't have. Morning comes in shades of grey, and the fog has somehow gotten worse. You can hear church bells tolling in the distance. Funerals, probably multiple, because it's February now and the death rate is peaking. You're heading to work again, different work this time, because dock labour isn't steady. Today you've found a job at a match factory in the East End, one of the places where young girls manufacture the little wooden sticks that bring fire to London's hearths. You're not working the matches yourself. That job is reserved for girls because their smaller hands are more dexterous, but you're hauling raw materials, which means you'll witness the industry up close. The factory is a long, low building that somehow manages to be both freezing and toxic. Large windows provide light, but no heat. 200 girls and women work here, ranging in age from 8 to 40, though most of the older workers are only in their 20s. They age fast in this work. You'll see why shortly. The girls work in rows, dipping wooden matchsticks into white phosphorus paste, then laying them out to dry. The phosphorus is what makes matches light with a single strike, a revolutionary technology that's turned matchmaking into a massive industry. It's also slow poison. White phosphorus causes a condition called phossy jaw, where the phosphorus vapor gets into your bloodwork through cuts in your mouth or bad teeth, and literally causes your jawbone to rot from the inside. The first sign is toothache. Then your jaw swells. Then it starts to glow in the dark. Yes, actually glow, because phosphorus is luminescent. Then it kills you, slowly and agonizingly. The youngest workers are barefoot, of course. Shoes cost money. Their hands are covered in sores from the phosphorus paste. They work 12-hour shifts in the cold, because while the factory needs light to see the work, heating the space would be an added expense that cuts into profit. The owner, a man you've never met, but whose wealth is evident from the property he owns across London, doesn't see the need for warmth when the workers keep working without it. You watch a girl who can't be more than 10 years old. Her name is probably something simple, Mary or Sarah or Annie, and she's been working here for 2 years already. Her hands move with mechanical precision. Dip, place, 500 times an hour, 6,000 times per shift. She's not going to school. She can't read. Her entire childhood is this factory, this cold, these phosphorus fumes. And statistically, historians tell us, she probably won't live to see 30. Child labour is everywhere in Victorian London, but winter makes it especially visible because you can see what it costs. Children chimney sweeps, small enough to climb inside flues, scraping out soot while breathing it in. The job requires being thin, so the sweeps often kept their workers half-starved. Many developed testicular cancer from soot exposure, the first occupation-specific cancer ever identified. Many suffocated in chimneys, some fell. The Climbing Boys Act of 1840 theoretically banned the practice, but enforcement was sporadic, and child sweeps continued working through the 1870s. The match girls make about 4p per day. That's roughly 2 shillings per week for 12-hour days, 6 days a week. Their families depend on this income. When you do the brutal mathematics of Victorian poverty, you realise that families needed every possible earner just to survive. A father working full-time might bring home 15 shillings a week. Rent and food consumed nearly all of it. So mothers worked and children worked, because the alternative was starvation or the workhouse. The workhouse, that lovely Victorian institution where the destitute could get shelter and food in exchange for hard labour under prison-like conditions, was the ultimate threat. Families would do almost anything to avoid it, because workhouses separated men, women, and children into different wings. Going in meant losing your family. It also meant shame, because workhouses were deliberately designed to be unpleasant enough to deter anyone who wasn't truly desperate. Historians still debate whether workhouses were humanitarian safety nets or cruel instruments of social control. Probably both. You see a funeral procession pass outside the factory windows. Another small white coffin. The girls barely look up from their work. They've seen too many to be affected anymore. London has developed an entire industry around child death. Small coffins, mass-produced for economy. Burial clubs, where families pay pennies per week for funeral insurance. High-density graveyards, where bodies are buried in layers. Bunhill Fields, one of London's major burial grounds, was so full by the 1850s that the ground level stood several feet above the original surface. Bodies buried on top of bodies. The infant mortality statistics are staggering. In wealthy neighbourhoods like Hampstead or Kensington, infant mortality runs around 80 per 1,000 live births. Bad, but manageable. In poor neighbourhoods like Bethnal Green or Bermondsey, it's 180 per 1,000, nearly 1 in 5. The difference is entirely environmental. Housing quality, nutrition, access to clean water, heating. The poor lived in conditions that actively killed children, and everyone knew it. But changing those conditions required massive investment in public health infrastructure that wouldn't come until the early 20th century. Some children never worked in factories at all. They worked the streets, crossing sweepers who cleared horse dung from roads so gentlemen could walk without soiling their shoes. Flower sellers, newspaper boys, pickpockets, prostitutes. Victorian London had an estimated 30,000 child prostitutes at any given time, most working out of sheer economic necessity. Winter was their worst season too, standing on corners in the cold, dressed in clothes too thin because provocative meant profitable, prey to violence and disease and weather simultaneously. By mid-afternoon, the girl you've been watching, Mary or Sarah or Annie, starts coughing. It's that wet, heavy cough you've heard everywhere. The forewoman, herself barely out of girlhood, sends her to the corner to rest. But there's no rest, not really. She'll be back at work in 5 minutes, because stopping means losing wages, and she can't afford to lose wages. So she'll cough through her shift, and she'll come back tomorrow, and she'll keep coming until she can't anymore. And then someone else, another desperate child, will take her place at the table. The machine doesn't stop. Winter doesn't care. And the matches keep getting made, one at a time, for a nation that needs fire to survive the cold. It's been 6 weeks since you arrived in London, and February has brought problems you didn't anticipate. The cold you expected, the fog you expected, the disease, the poverty, the grinding labour, all of that matched what you'd heard. But nobody mentioned the smell. London in winter doesn't just freeze, it festers. You're walking through the rookery of St Giles, one of London's worst slums, and the stench is overwhelming even through the cold. Human waste, rotting garbage, dead animals, coal smoke, industrial effluent, they all combine into an olfactory assault that makes your eyes water. And the cold makes it worse, not better, because everything that would normally drain away has frozen in place. Here's what's happening beneath your feet. Victorian London generates more human waste than any city in history, roughly 200 tonnes per day, and it has no functional sewer system. Or rather, it has sewers, but they're medieval affairs designed to handle rainwater, not sewage. The city's waste goes into cesspools, brick-lined pits beneath buildings where fecal matter and urine accumulate until someone pays to have them emptied. In wealthy neighbourhoods, cesspools get emptied regularly. In poor neighbourhoods like this one, they overflow. Now add winter. When temperatures drop, cesspools freeze. When they freeze, they can't drain. So waste accumulates at ground level, mixing with trash and mud and coal ash to create a toxic slurry that coats the streets. The Thames itself, London's main drainage channel, freezes along its edges. The river's flow slows. Waste doesn't flush downstream. It sits, stagnant, generating methane and breeding pathogens. The Great Stink of 1858, though that was a summer event, highlighted London's sewage crisis so spectacularly that Parliament finally funded Joseph Bazalgette's sewer system. But that system won't be complete until the 1870s. Right now, in the 1850s and 60s, London is drowning in its own waste, and winter makes the problem acute. Historians estimate that waterborne diseases killed nearly as many people as respiratory diseases in Victorian London. And cholera outbreaks followed predictable patterns tied to water supply contamination. You're passing a public water pump, the kind made famous by John Snow's 1854 investigation, linking a Broad Street pump to cholera transmission, and watching people fill buckets. This is where they get drinking water, the same groundwater that's contaminated by cesspools, tannery runoff, and industrial waste. Most working-class Londoners don't have piped water. They carry it from public pumps or buy it from water carriers who fill containers from the Thames. Neither option is safe, but winter makes it especially dangerous because frozen pipes mean fewer pumps working, so more people crowd around the ones still functioning, increasing contamination risk. Inside buildings, things aren't better. Remember those interior walls with frost patterns? Condensation from breathing and cooking has nowhere to go. Victorian buildings don't have vapour barriers or mechanical ventilation, so moisture condenses, pools, encourages mould growth. And when pipes freeze, which they frequently do in unheated buildings, residents go without water entirely. They melt snow if they can. They share pumps with dozens of neighbours if they can't. The wealthy have different problems. Their homes have water closets, indoor toilets connected to cesspools or sewers. But when pipes freeze, water closets don't flush. Wealthy families might have basement cesspools that, when full, leak into foundations or overflow into gardens. And unlike the poor, who were somewhat acclimated to horrible smells, wealthy Victorians found the stench of sewage breakdown particularly distressing. They burned incense, used perfumes, installed ventilation systems. None of it really worked. Historians still debate whether the miasma theory, the belief that disease came from bad air rather than pathogens, actually hindered public health efforts or accidentally helped by encouraging sanitation improvement. But in winter, the debate felt academic. Whether you believed in miasmas or germs, the smell alone was evidence that something was deeply wrong with London's infrastructure. You're standing on a bridge over Fleet Ditch, one of London's underground rivers now converted into a covered sewer. And even through the cold and fog, you can smell the methane rising from below. The Fleet Ditch is legendary for its foulness. It accepts waste from Hampstead, Camden and Clerkenwell, carrying it in a sluggish underground channel toward the Thames. During heavy rains, it overflows, flooding basements with raw sewage. During freezes, it backs up, sending waste upstream into homes. Living near the Fleet means living with sewage as a constant presence. Some neighbourhoods developed creative solutions. Night soil men, workers who emptied cesspools, usually at night to minimise offence, created an entire industry. They'd shovel waste into carts, haul it to dumps outside the city, sometimes sell it to farmers as fertiliser. It was brutal, disgusting work that paid relatively well because nobody wanted to do it. And in winter, it became even more brutal because frozen waste had to be chipped out like rock. The larger problem was systematic. London had grown from a medieval city of perhaps 50,000 to an industrial metropolis of millions, and its infrastructure hadn't kept pace. Water supply, sewerage, trash collection, drainage, all of it operated on systems designed for a city 1/20th the size. Bazalgette's sewers, when they finally came online in the 1870s, were revolutionary. They used gravity to carry waste away from the city centre, separating stormwater from sewage, incorporating ventilation and access points for maintenance. They're still in use today, one of Victorian engineering's greatest achievements. But until then, winter in London meant wading through frozen filth, drinking contaminated water, breathing air thick with methane and coal smoke, and hoping you didn't contract typhoid or cholera or dysentery. The smell, the cold, the disease, they all work together, turning winter into something that attacked from every angle. And tomorrow, you'll wake up and discover that your building's pipes have frozen solid, meaning you won't have water at all. Welcome to Victorian London. Try not to breathe too deeply. March finally arrives and you've survived. Not everyone has. You've watched neighbours disappear, their rooms rented to new occupants within days, the cycle continuing. But you're still here. Your hands are scarred from frostbite. Your cough is permanent now, a wet rattle that never quite goes away. You've lost weight despite working constantly, because calories spent trying to stay warm exceed calories consumed on your meagre budget. But you're alive, which is its own victory. Now you understand the mathematics that govern Victorian winter survival, the brutal calculus that every poor Londoner performed, consciously or unconsciously. It came down to resource allocation across 5 basic necessities: fuel, food, shelter, clothing, and work. You needed all 5, but you could rarely afford all 5 simultaneously. So you optimized, you made trades, you gambled on what you could endure and what would kill you. Fuel versus food was the fundamental trade-off. Coal cost a shilling per hundredweight, bread cost a halfpenny per pound. A week's worth of coal to keep marginally warm, or a week's worth of bread to keep marginally fed. Most people compromised. A little coal, a little bread, neither adequate. You burned enough fuel to prevent literal freezing, then supplemented with body heat from crowding multiple people into rooms. You ate enough food to prevent immediate starvation, then accepted hunger as constant background noise. Shelter cost was fixed. You paid rent or you slept outside, and outside meant death in winter. But shelter quality varied enormously. A decent room in a better neighbourhood cost 4 shillings per week. A horrible room in a rookery cost 2 shillings. Your body paid the difference in dampness, cold, disease exposure. Historians estimate that moving from a bad neighbourhood to a merely poor neighbourhood could add 5 years to your life expectancy. But those 2 extra shillings per week were impossible for most families to find. Clothing required capital investment. A decent wool coat cost £1 or more, 2 months' wages for a labourer. Most working-class Londoners owned exactly one set of clothes, supplemented with rags and borrowed items. They wore everything they owned simultaneously in winter, layering for insulation. When clothes wore out, which they did quickly under hard labour, replacement meant choosing between clothing and food. Some people wore clothes until they literally fell apart, then made do with whatever they could scavenge or receive from charity. Work was the variable that drove everything else. Steady employment meant steady income, meant survival. But steady employment was rare for most Londoners. You took casual labour when available: dock work, street sweeping, hauling, anything. You competed with thousands of others for every job. You accepted whatever wages employers offered because rejection meant no income at all. And in winter, when work slowed due to weather and illness, you fell behind. A week without work meant eviction, meant hunger, meant the workhouse. Some developed elaborate survival strategies. You could pawn items during winter's worst weeks, then redeem them when spring work picked up. London's pawn shops, there were roughly 500 scattered across the city, specialised in this cycle. 3 brass balls hanging outside marked the shop. You'd bring clothing, tools, anything valuable, receive perhaps a quarter of its worth, then pay interest to eventually reclaim it. If you couldn't pay, the item was sold. Historians estimate that 1/3 of London's working class regularly used pawn shops, cycling the same items in and out, season after season. Mutual aid networks helped. Families shared resources with neighbours, understanding that today's helper might be tomorrow's desperate. Church charities distributed coal and blankets, though never enough. Soup kitchens provided 1 hot meal per day during worst periods. Some employers gave Christmas bonuses or coal allowances, acts of paternalism that nonetheless meant survival for recipients. The state provided essentially nothing. Victorian Britain believed strongly in self-reliance and feared that charity created dependency. But perhaps the most important survival factor was information. Knowing where casual work appeared, knowing which pawn shops gave fair rates, knowing which street corners were warmer due to bakery steam vents or factory exhaust, knowing which churches distributed aid on which days. This information circulated through oral networks, poor people helping each other navigate a city that offered no official guidance. Migrants from rural areas, thousands arrived weekly, fleeing agricultural depression, often died their first winter simply because they didn't know these survival strategies. You're sitting in your room now, in early March, calculating. You've earned roughly 30 shillings over the past 6 weeks. You've spent 16 shillings on rent, 10 shillings on food, 3 shillings on coal, 1 shilling replacing a boot that fell apart. That leaves nothing, but somehow you've survived. You borrowed 2 pence for bread in late February. You skipped coal for a week and nearly froze. You found an extra shift moving furniture that paid double. The numbers barely work, but they work, and that's all that matters. Spring is coming. You can feel it in the morning air, fractionally warmer. The fog is lifting slightly. You can see across streets now, not just feet ahead. Birds are returning, their songs strange after months of silence. Work will pick up as construction and shipping resume full schedules. Food prices will drop as fresh produce arrives. The death rate will fall from perhaps 30 deaths per 1,000 annually in winter to maybe 25 in summer. Better, but still brutal by modern standards. And next winter, you'll do it all again. Because this is life in Victorian London for millions of people. Not an adventure, not a romantic historical period, but a grinding test of endurance where survival was its own reward. The city was building empire, generating immense wealth, pioneering technologies that would transform the world. But that progress was paid for in frozen bodies, ruined lungs, and childhood spent working instead of living. You survived one winter. Statistically, you'll survive maybe 20 more before disease or accident or simple exhaustion takes you. Probably sometime in your 40s. That's the average life expectancy for working-class Londoners. The wealthy live into their 60s or 70s. The difference is measured in warm rooms, adequate food, and winters that don't try to kill you. But you don't dwell on that. You think about spring. You think about tomorrow's work. You think about staying alive one more day. Because that's the mathematics of survival, calculated moment by moment, winter after winter, in a city that demanded everything and offered so little in return. The fire in your room has burned down to embers now, glowing soft in the darkness. Outside, London continues, always continues, this great beast of a city, breathing coal smoke and ambition and the lives of millions. But tonight you can rest. You've walked through those frozen streets, felt that killing fog on your skin, heard those consumptive coughs echo through tenement halls. You've seen the children with bare feet, the workers with blue fingers, the funeral processions that marked winter's harvest. What makes Victorian London winters brutal wasn't just the cold or the fog or the disease, though all of those were real and terrible. It was the proximity. It was the knowing that warmth existed, that safety existed, that survival didn't have to be so hard. But those comforts were distributed by wealth, not need, and the city simply accepted that winter would kill the vulnerable as a kind of natural selection. Tragic, but inevitable. We've come far since then. Building codes, labour laws, public health systems, social safety nets, all the infrastructure that protects us from winter's worst now, emerged from Victorian suffering. Those frozen children, those consumptive workers, those desperate mathematics of survival, they weren't in vain, though that's cold comfort. Their endurance pushed reform. Their deaths documented the cost. Their lives insisted, finally, that a wealthy society could do better. So rest now. Let the images fade, the fog lifting, the spring arriving, the long dark season ending, as it always eventually does. Breathe easy in your warm room, your safe space. And maybe, as you drift towards sleep, spare a thought for all those who survived winters far harder than ours.